The little black girl begged the biker, saying a shredded piece of her mom's shirt was found beside a restricted tank. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a quiet night, the kind where only the hum of the city could be heard and the neon lights flickered in the distance. That was until the phone rang. Jack, a grizzled biker with years of experience on the road, was in his garage working on his bike. His hands were covered in grease, but the moment he heard the phone buzz, he froze. The call was from a hospital in a small town miles away. The voice on the other end was frantic, breathless, and unmistakably scared. Mr. Morrison, this is Elena Vargas from Mercy General Hospital. We need your help. There's a little girl here. Her name is Aisha Coleman, and she's in a very serious situation. Her mother's missing, and we just found a shredded piece of her shirt near a restricted military area. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He knew that name. Aisha. It hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some random kid. This was the daughter of Rick Coleman, a former club member who had left the biker life years ago to settle down. Jack had promised Rick, right before he left, that he would look after his family. That promise had weighed heavily on him since. What happened to her mother? Jack asked, his voice low, steady despite the shock. Elena hesitated. We don't know exactly. The situation is still unclear. But the piece of shirt we found it's just beyond strange. It was near a military restricted area, and the local authorities are involved now. We're not sure what's going on, but we need someone with experience to help this little girl. Jack didn't need another second to think. I'm on my way, he said, grabbing his jacket, his mind already racing with possibilities. He'd seen this kind of thing before, dangerous, secretive, and full of questions that no one wanted to answer. As he grabbed his keys and opened the door to his garage, the weight of the moment hit him. This wasn't just a favor for a friend. This was a promise made years ago, a promise that Jack would never break. He picked up his phone, sent a message to his club. Thunderwolves, we've got a situation. A little girl needs our help. Pack your gear. We ride at dawn. The messages flooded in immediately. I'm in. Count me in. Let's go. Within minutes, the entire club was on alert. Jack could hear the sounds of engines starting, the familiar rumble of his brothers getting ready for a ride. But this wasn't just another ride. This was personal. It was a mission to protect one of their own. As Jack looked out across the garage, filled with the machines that had been his companions through thick and thin, he thought about the little girl. He remembered the last time he had seen Rick, how they had laughed about old times. Jack had promised him he would always have his back. And now, Jack was about to fulfill that promise, no matter the cost. The air was thick with anticipation as the engines roared to life. The Thunderwolves were ready. The ride to the hospital, 400 miles away, would be a long one, but Jack knew there was no turning back. It was time to keep his promise. The stakes were high, and the danger was real. But with the Thunderwolves behind him, Jack was ready to face whatever came next. The road stretched out before them, endless and dark, as the Thunderwolves revved their engines and sped down the highway. Jack led the pack, his leather jacket flapping in the wind as the familiar sound of roaring Harleys filled the night air. The ride had been going on for hours, the harsh desert landscape offering no comfort, just an unforgiving expanse of barren land and empty sky. Jack's mind was focused on one thing: keeping the promise he made to Rick to protect his daughter Aisha. It was the only thing that mattered right now. The night was cold, the wind sharp against their faces, but the Thunderwolves were used to this. They had ridden through worse. They had faced danger together, and they knew that tonight, the stakes were even higher. The weight of the situation was heavy on Jack's shoulders, but he couldn't afford to show it. Not now. Not with Aisha counting on him. As the miles passed, Jack's thoughts kept drifting back to the phone call he received earlier. The shredded piece of Aisha's mother's shirt found near a restricted military area. It wasn't just a coincidence. Something was going on, something dangerous. And whoever was involved wasn't going to stop just because a group of bikers was heading their way. Jack tightened his grip on the handlebars, his jaw set. He knew the risks, but he wasn't about to back down. The Thunderwolves were family, and when family called, they answered. About an hour later, the club stopped for fuel at a small gas station in the middle of nowhere. The wind howled across the lot, but the bikes had been running strong, and the riders needed a break. Jack pulled his bike to the pumps, followed by his brothers. They dismounted, each biker going about their business, checking their gear, stretching their legs, and refueling. Jack didn't waste time. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number for Elena Vargas at the hospital. He needed more information. The voice on the other end answered quickly. "Hello, Mr. Morrison. How's the ride?" Elena asked, trying to keep things light. But Jack could hear the tension in her voice. "We're getting closer. I need to know more about this restricted area. What exactly is going on there? Why was Aisha's mom's shirt found there?" Jack asked, his voice low and focused. Elena sighed, and Jack could hear the sound of papers shuffling on her end. "I've been trying to get answers too, but the local authorities are being tight-lipped. From what we've gathered, the area is a former military testing ground. There's nothing but rumors and whispers about what was going on there, but it's highly classified. I don't know who was involved, but I have a bad feeling about it. Aisha's mother might have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but I think she knew something she wasn't supposed to." Jack's stomach tightened. This wasn't just a random kidnapping. This was something much bigger. "Do you have any idea who's behind this?" Jack asked, his voice tinged with concern. "We're still trying to figure that out, but we know that the people involved are connected to some dangerous groups." "This isn't just a simple abduction," Elena replied. "You need to be careful when you get here. Whoever is involved, they won't hesitate to take action if they think they're being exposed." Jack's mind raced. He knew Elena was right. Whoever was behind this would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. And now, Aisha and her mother were caught in the middle of something far bigger than anyone had anticipated. "We'll be there soon," Jack said, hanging up the phone. He turned to his brothers, who had gathered around him, listening to the conversation. "We're about to walk into something bigger than we thought. Stay sharp," Jack said, his voice low and commanding. The Thunderwolves nodded in unison. No one said a word. They all knew what was at stake. They had one mission: get Aisha to safety and figure out what had happened to her mother. The engines roared to life again as the group mounted their bikes. The sound of the Harleys was deafening as they sped off into the night, the horizon just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Jack felt a sense of urgency in his chest. They weren't just riding to a hospital anymore. They were riding into a war zone. A war zone filled with secrets, lies, and people willing to do anything to protect their interests. And the Thunderwolves were about to tear it all wide open. The Thunderwolves rode hard through the night, the hum of their engines cutting through the desert air as they sped toward their destination. Jack's mind was focused, but his gut was tight with unease. Every mile they covered felt heavier, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Aisha was just a kid, a little girl caught in a nightmare she didn't deserve. But it was more than that, much more. The shredded piece of her mother's shirt found near the restricted area only added layers to the mystery. What was really going on here? And who was behind it? Jack's thoughts flickered back to the phone call he'd had with Elena earlier. The more he heard, the less he understood. A former military test site, dangerous groups, a mother and daughter dragged into something that wasn't just a random act of violence. Jack glanced at the riders around him. Every one of them was battle-tested, each with a history of hardship and sacrifice. Yet even they couldn't prepare for what was ahead. The sun had just begun to rise when they pulled into a small, run-down town. The hospital was nearby, but the place looked more like a ghost town than anything that should have been bustling with activity. Jack felt an odd chill as he looked around. It didn't feel right. This wasn't just some random hospital. This was the epicenter of something much larger. They parked their bikes in the dimly lit lot behind the hospital, the buildings towering over them like silent sentinels. The quietness of the place seemed unnatural, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Jack took a deep breath and motioned for the group to stay alert. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was a confrontation with a hidden force. Jack approached the back entrance of the hospital, his steps heavy but purposeful. His brothers followed him, the clanking of their leather jackets a reminder of the loyalty that bound them together. The door creaked open, and they slipped inside, the smell of antiseptic and dust filling the air. They were in the back corridors now, hidden from sight, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The place felt abandoned, but there were no signs of neglect. It was as if someone had cleaned up just enough to make it look operational, but the underlying tension was palpable. A voice echoed down the hallway. Jack stiffened, but it wasn't the sound of an enemy. "You made it," Elena said as she stepped into view, her face drawn, tired, but determined. "We don't have much time," she added quickly, glancing over her shoulder. "They're already here." Jack didn't waste a second. "Who's here?" he asked, his voice low but commanding. Elena motioned for them to follow her. "The authorities, but there's more to it. They've been covering up everything. The military, private contractors, and—" She stopped herself, realizing how dangerous the information was. "I don't know how far this goes, but Aisha's mother was involved in something bigger than we thought. She knew too much." Jack's pulse quickened. "Where's Aisha?" he asked, cutting through the tension. Elena led them through the winding hallways, their footsteps echoing in the silence. She turned a corner and stopped in front of a small, sterile room. The door was cracked open just enough to see inside. Aisha was there, sitting on the bed, her legs tucked up under her. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but when she saw Jack and the Thunder Wolves, her face softened in recognition. "Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was so scared. I didn't know if you'd come." Jack knelt beside her, his heart aching for the little girl. He placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. "We're here now, Aisha," he said softly, his voice full of reassurance. "You're safe." The words were meant to be comforting, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were still far from safe. They had no idea who was after them, or why. The mystery deepened with every passing minute. As Jack stood, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There was a man standing at the door, watching them. His face was obscured by a hood, but there was no mistaking the air of authority he carried. His presence sent a chill through the room. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "This is bigger than you think." Jack's hand instinctively moved to the knife at his side. The man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "I suggest you leave now, while you still can." The tension in the room thickened, and the rest of the Thunder Wolves shifted, ready for action. Jack didn't flinch. "You're in our way," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet menace. "We're not leaving without answers." The man smiled, but there was no humor in his expression. "Then you'll regret it." Just as Jack took a step toward him, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows, his footsteps barely audible. Jack's mind raced. They had just been threatened, but something told him that was only the beginning. Aisha's mother was deep into something dangerous, and now the Thunder Wolves were in the middle of it all. But Jack wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Jack's instincts kicked in the moment the man disappeared into the shadows. His hand tightened around the hilt of his knife as his eyes scanned the hallway, but the man was gone, vanished as quickly as he had appeared. Jack stood there for a moment, the tension in the air thick and suffocating. The Thunder Wolves remained silent, waiting for Jack to make the next move. Aisha, still sitting on the bed, looked up at him with wide, worried eyes. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack turned back to her, his expression softened, but the worry still lingered. "We don't know yet, Aisha," he said, keeping his voice steady. "But we're not leaving until we get some answers." He stood up, his mind racing. They had come to protect her, to bring her mother back, but now it was clear that this was much bigger than just a missing person case. Whoever was behind this knew how to cover their tracks, and they weren't afraid to threaten anyone who got in their way. Jack turned to Elena, who was still standing near the door, her face pale. "What do we do now?" Jack asked, his voice low. Elena glanced over her shoulder, checking the hallway before stepping closer to him. "We need to move fast," she said, her voice tight. "The authorities are on their way, but they're already compromised. I've been trying to dig up information on what happened to Aisha's mother, but the deeper I go, the more dangerous it gets. There's something they don't want anyone to know, something about the military and private contractors. But Aisha's mother, she knew too much. She was trying to expose them." Jack clenched his jaw, trying to keep his emotions in check. Aisha's mother had been trying to expose something that could bring down powerful people. Jack had heard rumors about military cover-ups, black ops, and shady contractors, but he never imagined he'd be walking into the middle of it. "We have to get her out of here," Jack said, his mind already planning their next move. "We can't just sit here and wait for the authorities to show up." We need to find out what's really going on and get Aisha somewhere safe. Elena nodded, her eyes filled with determination. I'll help you, she said, her voice strong despite the fear in her eyes. But we need to be careful. If they find out we're onto them, they won't hesitate to take us all down. Jack turned to the rest of the Thunder Wolves, who were gathered around, their faces grim. They were ready for whatever came next. Let's move, Jack ordered, his voice steady. The group of bikers gathered their gear, preparing for the unknown. Aisha was going to be their priority, but Jack knew they couldn't leave without figuring out what had happened to her mother. The hospital was a maze of hallways and closed-off rooms, but Jack had a feeling that the answers they were looking for weren't far. As they moved through the dark corridors, the tension in the air grew thicker. Every sound, every creak of the building, felt amplified. The silence was oppressive, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They reached a door at the end of a narrow hallway. It was locked, but that didn't stop Jack. He kicked it in with ease, the door splintering under the force of the impact. Inside, the room was filled with computers, monitors, and files scattered everywhere. It looked like a high-tech command center, but it had an eerie, abandoned feel to it. This is it, Elena whispered, stepping forward. This is where they've been hiding the truth. Jack looked around the room, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the documents on the desks. There were names, dates, and military codes, everything pointing to a massive operation, but no concrete answers. As Jack flipped through the papers, a file caught his attention. It was marked with the words, Project Blackout. His heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew it was important. He grabbed the file and handed it to Elena. What is this? He asked. Elena's face went pale as she looked at the file. This is what I've been looking for, she said, her voice trembling. Project Blackout. It's the code name for a covert military operation. It involves testing dangerous weapons and technologies, things that should never have been allowed out in the open. Aisha's mother, she was investigating this project. She was trying to stop it, but they were too powerful. They silenced her. Jack felt his blood run cold. They weren't just up against a group of criminals. This was something far darker, a conspiracy that reached deep into the heart of the government and military. But there was more. Elena looked at the file again, her eyes scanning the details. There's more, she whispered. The project, it's not just about weapons. It's about control. They've been using children, experimenting on them. Jack's mind raced as he processed the information. Aisha's mother found out about this, and that's why they came after her, he said, his voice low with disbelief. Elena nodded, her eyes filled with sorrow. Yes, and now, they know Aisha knows too much. They'll stop at nothing to cover their tracks. Jack's hand tightened around the file, his determination hardening. They weren't just going to let this slide. He wasn't going to let Aisha's mother's death be in vain. We need to finish this, Jack said, his voice filled with resolve. We'll expose them, no matter what it takes. The Thunder Wolves stood in the room, ready to do whatever it took to bring justice to Aisha's family, and to stop the darkness that had been festering for far too long. The atmosphere in the room was tense, thick with the kind of silence that came just before the storm. Jack held the file marked Project Blackout tightly in his hands, his mind racing with the implications of the documents inside. Aisha, still sitting on the bed, clutched the corners of the blanket as she watched them, her innocent eyes filled with confusion and fear. She had already been through too much for one so young. Jack glanced at Elena, her face pale with the knowledge of what they were about to face. This was no longer just about saving Aisha's mother or protecting the girl. It was about stopping something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. The project, as Elena had said, was not just about military technology. It was about control over innocent lives, using them as test subjects in twisted experiments. Children had been used, manipulated, and sacrificed in the name of power. The file in Jack's hands confirmed everything. We have to act now, Jack said, his voice a low growl. This has gone too far. We can't let them cover this up. Elena nodded in agreement, her eyes flickering with determination. I've been digging for months, but I couldn't get close enough. They've got too many people on the inside. Too many strings they're pulling. But we have this now. She paused, looking at Jack. We have the evidence we need. We just have to get it out before they come after us. Jack looked at his brothers, each of them standing tall, prepared for whatever came next. He knew they were all in this together. This wasn't just a fight for Aisha anymore. This was a fight for justice. The door to the room suddenly creaked open, and Jack's instincts kicked in. A shadow moved in the doorway, and the unmistakable click of boots echoed down the hallway. Someone was coming. Jack turned to Elena. "Where's the nearest exit?" he asked, his voice urgent. Elena pointed to a hallway at the far end of the building. "There's a back door, but we need to hurry. If they find us with that file, we'll be dead before we make it out." Without hesitation, Jack nodded and motioned for the Thunderwolves to follow him. They moved swiftly, their boots barely making a sound as they crept through the corridors. The tension in the air was almost suffocating, and Jack could feel the weight of their every step. They weren't just up against a group of criminals anymore. They were up against a system, a web of lies and power that reached deep into the government and military. As they neared the exit, Jack's mind raced. The authorities, the private contractors, the people behind Project Blackout, they were all connected, and they were willing to do whatever it took to keep their secrets buried. Jack could already hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. They didn't have much time. "Get ready," Jack whispered to the group. "This is about to get ugly." They reached the back door, and Jack threw it open, the cold night air rushing in. The sounds of the city were distant now, replaced by the hum of motorcycles idling in the parking lot. The Thunderwolves had made it out, but Jack knew this was just the beginning. He could feel the weight of the file in his hand. They had the proof. Now they had to survive long enough to expose the truth. As they made their way to the bikes, Jack heard a voice from behind. "Not so fast." The man from before, the one who had threatened them, stepped out of the shadows, a smirk on his face. "I warned you," he said, his tone calm, as though he had all the time in the world. Jack turned to face him, his grip tightening around the handle of his bike. "I don't have time for this," Jack said, his voice cold. "You're in our way." The man raised his hands in mock surrender. "I'm not here to stop you, Morrison," he said. "I'm here to make sure you understand what you're up against." Jack's eyes narrowed. "And what's that?" The man chuckled darkly. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? But you're just a pawn in a much bigger game. You won't make it far with that file. Trust me, the people who want it, they don't lose." Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't take his eyes off the man. He wasn't intimidated, not now. "We'll see about that," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. The man stepped back, fading into the shadows. "You're not ready for what's coming," he said cryptically, before disappearing into the night. Jack stood there for a moment, his mind processing the man's words. They had just scratched the surface of something much bigger than they had ever imagined. But Jack wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let them win. With the Thunderwolves by his side, they would take on whatever came next. As the engines roared to life, Jack felt a surge of determination. They weren't just fighting for Aisha anymore. They were fighting for everyone who had been silenced by power, for everyone who had been used and discarded. This was their fight now, and they weren't going to lose. The Thunderwolves revved their engines, ready to take on whatever danger awaited them. Jack glanced at his brothers one last time before they rode off into the night, the weight of the file still heavy in his hands. The battle for the truth had just begun. The roar of the Thunderwolves' engines echoed through the empty streets, a constant reminder that they were running out of time. Jack led the pack, his mind still racing with the chilling conversation he had just had with the mysterious man. Every word the man spoke felt like a warning, a threat of things to come, but Jack wasn't the type to back down. Not now, not when Aisha's life was on the line, and certainly not after uncovering the depth of Project Blackout. They had the evidence now, but the real battle was just beginning. The further they rode, the more Jack could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The sun had long since set, leaving them in darkness, but the road ahead was clear, at least for now. Aisha, still riding behind one of the bikers, clung to the vest of her protector, her small hands gripping the leather tightly. She had been through so much, too much for someone her age, and now she was part of something bigger, something far darker than she could ever imagine. Jack glanced back at her, his gaze softening. She was just a child, but she had already seen things that most adults would never have to face. The Thunderwolves knew that. They had all seen the darkness that the world sometimes hid away, but this was different. This was a fight for survival, for truth, and for justice. They had to protect Aisha, and they had to stop whoever was behind Project Blackout. Jack's phone buzzed, breaking him from his thoughts. He pulled it from his jacket pocket, glancing at the screen. It was Elena. He answered quickly. "What's going on?" he asked. Elena's voice came through, strained but clear. "They've already moved. I don't know how they found us, but the authorities are being mobilized. We need to act fast before they get the upper hand." Jack's grip on the handlebars tightened. "Where's the next stop?" he asked. "There's a safe house," Elena said. "I've been in contact with a friend who can help. It's not far from here, but we need to get there before they find out we're coming." Jack looked over at the other bikers, giving them a quick nod. "We're heading to the safe house." "Keep sharp," he said. The group's engines revved louder as they shifted into a higher gear, picking up speed. The road was long and winding, but Jack knew the clock was ticking. The authorities wouldn't stop looking for them, and with Project Blackout hanging over their heads, they needed to stay one step ahead. As they rode, Jack's thoughts continued to spiral. The military, private contractors, the twisted experiments that had been carried out on children. He had never imagined he'd be tangled up in something so sinister. They weren't just dealing with a few corrupt individuals. They were up against an entire network of people who had more power and resources than Jack and his brothers could ever hope to face on their own. But they had something the enemy didn't. They had the truth. They had the file. They had the evidence. And they weren't going to let anyone silence them. The ride continued, the sound of their engines filling the night air as they approached the safe house. It was an old, secluded building tucked away at the edge of a forgotten road, hidden from view by thick trees and overgrown foliage. As they pulled into the driveway, Jack felt a sense of relief wash over him, but it was fleeting. The real work was just about to begin. They parked the bikes and dismounted, the cool night air biting at their skin. Jack led the group to the door, his instincts on high alert. Elena had given them the key, but that didn't mean it was safe. "Stay alert," Jack muttered, his voice low. The last thing they needed was to walk into an ambush. He turned the key in the lock, and the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Inside was a small, sparse room. Nothing fancy, just a place to rest, regroup, and plan. Jack motioned for the group to spread out, keeping watch. They didn't have long. They had to go over everything they had learned, figure out who was behind Project Blackout, and how they could bring the whole operation to light. But as Jack glanced at Aisha, sitting quietly in the corner, he knew one thing for sure. No matter what it took, they were going to get her mother's justice. They couldn't let the monsters behind this project get away with it. As Jack sat down at the table, the weight of the file in his hands felt heavier than ever. He opened it, scanning the documents again. There had to be something they missed, some clue that would lead them to the heart of Project Blackout. But as he flipped through the pages, a name caught his eye, Sergeant Derek Ward. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He knew that name. Ward was a high-ranking officer in the military, someone with connections and power. He had been linked to several covert operations in the past, but nothing had ever been proven. Until now. Jack leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "We've got him," he muttered under his breath. The Thunderwolves gathered around the table, leaning in as Jack laid out the new information. Ward was the key. He was the one pulling the strings behind Project Blackout. And if they could expose him, they could bring down the entire operation. Jack looked up at the group. "This ends now," he said, his voice firm. "We take down Ward, and we expose everything. No more hiding. No more lies." The Thunderwolves nodded in agreement. They had come this far, and they weren't stopping now. The time for running was over. They were going to fight back, and they were going to win. The night was heavy with tension as the Thunderwolves sat in the dimly lit room, the flickering light from a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Jack had just laid out the crucial information they had uncovered about Sergeant Derek Ward, the man at the heart of Project Blackout. Every one of them knew that the path ahead was going to be dangerous. There was no going back now. Jack leaned forward, his hand resting on the table, the file containing the evidence they had gathered sitting in front of him. He could feel the weight of it. The lives of those who had been silenced, the lives of innocent children, and now Aisha's mother. They couldn't let Ward get away with this. "Ward's been hiding in plain sight," Jack said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "He's got too many people on the inside. But we know his weaknesses now. We just need to hit him hard, where it hurts." Elena, standing next to him, nodded. "We need to gather more intel. If we go in without knowing everything, we're walking into a trap. We've got one shot at this." The rest of the Thunderwolves agreed. each of them preparing mentally for the mission ahead. They couldn't afford any mistakes. Aisha, sitting quietly in the corner, had been listening to every word. Jack caught her gaze and gave her a reassuring smile. She still looked shaken, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes now. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was part of this, and Jack knew that she'd need to be strong to get through what was coming next. "You ready, kid?" Jack asked, his tone soft but firm. Aisha nodded. "I'm ready," she said, her voice surprisingly steady for someone who had been through so much. Jack's heart swelled with pride. This little girl had seen more horror than anyone should in a lifetime, but she had the heart of a fighter. He would make sure she got out of this alive. He turned back to the group. "We'll go after Ward tomorrow. We'll hit him where it hurts, his connections, his influence. We have the evidence, and we know where to find him. This ends tomorrow." The group nodded in agreement, the resolve in their eyes as strong as ever. The next morning, the Thunderwolves geared up. They mounted their Harleys, the rumble of the engines filling the air. The plan was simple. Infiltrate the facility where Ward was hiding, gather whatever evidence they could, and expose him for the monster he was. As they rode, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this mission was different. This wasn't just about protecting Aisha anymore. This was about justice. Ward had taken too much, hurt too many people, and Jack wasn't going to let him get away with it. The sun hung low in the sky as they approached the facility. It was heavily guarded, but Jack had planned for this. They had the element of surprise on their side, and that was something Ward wasn't expecting. "Stay sharp," Jack said, his voice low. "We move quickly and quietly. We get in, get the evidence, and get out. No mistakes." They arrived at the perimeter of the facility, the sound of their bikes echoing in the distance. They dismounted, slipping into the shadows, moving like ghosts. Jack's heart raced as they made their way to the entrance. He knew that Ward was a dangerous man, but this was bigger than just him. This was about the people he had hurt, the lives he had ruined. They reached the building's entrance, a steel door that was surprisingly easy to open. Jack motioned for the group to follow him inside. They crept down the hallways, their footsteps soft on the concrete floor. The air was thick with the smell of old machinery and dust. The further they went, the more Jack could feel the weight of the moment. This was the heart of the operation, the place where it all began. They reached a room at the end of the hall, the door locked but not reinforced. Jack gave a quick signal, and one of the Thunderwolves, known for his skills with locks, stepped forward. With a few twists of his tools, the door clicked open. Inside was a small office, and on the desk sat a computer. Jack approached it carefully, his eyes scanning the room. This was it, the evidence they needed to bring down Project Blackout. As Jack powered up the computer, a message flashed on the screen: "Access denied." He cursed under his breath. Ward had locked everything down tight. "Looks like we're going to have to do this the hard way," Jack muttered. One of the Thunderwolves pulled out a hard drive and plugged it into the computer. "We've got this," he said confidently. It didn't take long for the drive to download the files they needed. As the data transferred, Jack's mind raced. He had no idea what he was about to uncover, but he knew that it was going to be bigger than anything they had ever imagined. As the files finished downloading, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. The Thunderwolves froze. They had to move fast. Jack grabbed the hard drive and motioned for the group to retreat. They moved quickly, retracing their steps to the exit. But just as they reached the door, a voice stopped them. "Not so fast," the voice called. Jack turned to see two armed guards standing in the doorway, blocking their escape. His heart raced, but he didn't hesitate. "Get down," Jack shouted as he dove behind cover. The Thunderwolves reacted instantly, guns drawn, ready for anything. The time for silence was over. The battle had begun. The sound of gunfire echoed through the hallway as the Thunderwolves moved into action. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The guards were closing in fast, but Jack wasn't about to let them stop him. The plan had been simple: get the evidence, get out. But now, everything had changed. Now, it was a fight for survival. The two guards at the door had drawn their weapons, but they hadn't counted on the Thunderwolves. They were outnumbered, but they had the element of surprise on their side. Jack crouched low behind cover, his eyes scanning the room for an opening. "Cover me," Jack shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. Without hesitation, the Thunderwolves opened fire, forcing the guards to duck for cover. The air was thick with tension, the sound of gunshots mingling with the roar of motorcycles outside. Aisha, still near the back of the room, clutched the edge of the desk, her wide eyes filled with fear. Jack couldn't look at her now. He had to focus on the threat in front of him. But he knew they were running out of time. More guards would be on the way. "We need to move now," Jack shouted. He motioned for the Thunderwolves to move toward the back exit. They had the evidence they needed. They couldn't stay and fight. The Thunderwolves broke cover, moving swiftly but cautiously toward the door. Jack led the charge, his hand gripping the hard drive tightly in his jacket pocket. They couldn't let anyone take it from them. Not now, not when they were so close to exposing everything. As they neared the door, another wave of guards appeared, this time from the side hallway. They were trapped. Jack's mind raced. There was no way out through the front. They'd have to fight their way out. "Get ready," Jack shouted. "We make a stand here, but we're not stopping until we're out of this building." The Thunderwolves braced themselves, forming a line at the back of the room. Jack could see the fear in their eyes, but there was something else there too, determination. They had come this far, and they weren't going to die in some dark corner of a facility. Not now, not when they had so much at stake. The door slammed open, and more guards poured into the room, weapons drawn. Jack didn't wait. He stepped forward, gun raised, and fired. The guard in the front crumpled to the ground. The rest of the Thunderwolves followed suit, each one picking off a target. The air was thick with the sound of gunfire, but Jack's focus never wavered. His eyes were fixed on the door. It was their only way out. But even as they fought their way through the building, Jack knew they couldn't hold out forever. They needed a plan. They needed to move. The Thunderwolves pushed forward, their guns blazing. The guards were falling, but more kept coming. Jack's heart raced as he glanced over his shoulder. Aisha was still there, behind them, her face pale but determined. She hadn't run. She hadn't given up. Jack's eyes met hers, and in that moment, he knew what he had to do. He wasn't just fighting for the Thunderwolves anymore. He was fighting for her. "We need to get to the bikes," Jack shouted. Now, they fought their way through the hallways, pushing forward toward the exit. The guards were relentless, but the Thunderwolves were faster, more determined. They reached the back door, and Jack kicked it open, the fresh air of the night hitting him like a wave. The bikes were waiting, engines running, ready to go. But there was no time to waste. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance. More authorities were on the way. "Get on the bikes," Jack shouted. "We need to move, now." Aisha hesitated for a moment, but Jack's commanding voice snapped her back into action. She ran toward one of the bikes, climbing onto the back, gripping onto the rider's jacket. The Thunderwolves mounted their Harleys, the engines roaring to life as they sped out of the parking lot. The chase had begun. Jack led the way, his heart still pounding in his chest. The file they had, the proof they had gathered, it was their ticket to bringing down Ward and the entire operation. But it wouldn't be easy. They weren't out of danger yet. The road ahead was dark, winding, and filled with uncertainty. But Jack knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to stop. Not until they had exposed the truth. Not until they had made sure that Project Blackout was shut down for good. The Thunderwolves sped down the highway, the sound of their bikes filling the night air. Jack glanced over his shoulder, his mind focused, but his heart still heavy with the weight of what they had just done. They had made it out alive, but the real battle was far from over. They had the evidence, but now they had to make sure it reached the right hands. They had to make sure Ward couldn't hide behind his power any longer. The Thunderwolves weren't done yet. They were just getting started. The roar of the Thunderwolves' engines echoed down the winding roads as they sped through the night. Jack's mind was laser-focused on the mission ahead, but the adrenaline from the earlier battle still coursed through his veins. They had escaped the facility, but they weren't out of the woods yet. The file they had stolen, containing everything about Project Blackout, was their only hope of bringing down Sergeant Derek Ward and exposing the darkness that had been festering under the surface. But there was no doubt in Jack's mind that Ward wasn't done fighting back. The Thunderwolves had only seen the tip of the iceberg. The stakes had risen, and the clock was ticking. Jack glanced over his shoulder, checking to see if the others were still with him. The group rode in tight formation, a well-oiled machine. Aisha, clinging to one of the bikers behind her, still looked shaken, but there was a new fire in her eyes. She was part of this now, and Jack could see that the trauma she'd endured had forged something stronger inside her. The Thunderwolves weren't just fighting for the truth anymore. They were fighting for her, for Aisha. We need to get the file to the right people, Jack muttered to himself, his grip on the handlebars tightening. He couldn't afford any more mistakes. If they weren't careful, they could end up like everyone else who had tried to expose the truth before them, dead or silenced. The road ahead was long, and the tension in the air was thick. As they approached a small, secluded town, Jack's phone buzzed. He took it out of his pocket, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Elena. "They're looking for us. We need to get the file to someone who can make it public. Meet me at the old diner in Green Ridge. It's the only place they won't be able to trace." Jack's heart skipped a beat. The diner was a safe house. Elena had been in contact with a few trustworthy allies, people who had the resources to get the information into the right hands. But there was no time to waste. They were being hunted, and the longer they stayed in one place, the higher the chance of being caught. "Green Ridge," Jack muttered to himself, his voice low. "Let's go." He signaled to the group, and the Thunderwolves adjusted their course, speeding up. The town of Green Ridge wasn't far, but Jack knew the authorities would be hot on their trail. If they didn't get to Elena and the diner in time, everything would be for nothing. The ride felt like it lasted an eternity, the miles stretching on, the sounds of their bikes and the occasional roar of sirens chasing them from behind. As they approached the outskirts of Green Ridge, Jack could feel the weight of the file pressing against his chest. It was their lifeline, their only hope of bringing down Ward and ending Project Blackout. They couldn't afford to fail now. They reached the diner just before dawn. It was small, unassuming, and tucked away at the end of a quiet street. Jack pulled his bike up to the back entrance, signaling for the others to follow. The Thunderwolves dismounted quickly, their movements swift and practiced. They couldn't risk being seen by anyone on the streets. Elena was waiting inside, her expression tense but relieved when she saw Jack and the others. "You made it," she said, her voice hushed but full of gratitude. "We don't have much time. They've already sent teams to track you down. This is our only chance." Jack nodded, glancing around the diner. It was empty, save for Elena and a few of her trusted contacts. The place had always been a safe haven for those in the know. They couldn't stay here long, but it was the perfect place to hand over the file and let the truth finally come to light. Elena took the file from Jack's hands, her eyes scanning the papers quickly. She turned to her contact, a woman named Sarah who had connections within the media. "Get this to the press. Everything in this file has to be exposed," Elena said, her voice low but firm. "We can't let them silence us." Sarah nodded, taking the file and slipping it into her bag. "I'll make sure it gets to the right people." "You don't have to worry about that," she said. Jack's gaze flicked back to the Thunderwolves, his brothers in arms. They had made it this far, but the real work wasn't over yet. Ward wasn't going to give up without a fight. "We still have to deal with Ward," Jack said, his voice steady. "We've taken the first step, but this isn't over. Not by a long shot." Elena looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. "We'll deal with him," she said, her voice resolute. "But now, we have the truth. We've got the evidence we need to bring him down." Jack nodded, but something in the back of his mind still gnawed at him. Ward was powerful, dangerous. He wouldn't stop until he had destroyed everything in his path. And the Thunderwolves had just made themselves his biggest target. The sound of motorcycles could be heard in the distance. The authorities were closing in. It was time to go. "We need to get out of here," Jack said urgently. "Stay sharp. We'll head for the safe house. Let's move." The Thunderwolves quickly mounted their bikes once again, the engines roaring to life. They had the file, they had the evidence, and they were heading toward the next phase of the mission. The road ahead was still dangerous, but Jack knew one thing for sure. They weren't done yet. This was just the beginning of the end. The sound of motorcycles tearing down the road was the only thing Jack could focus on as he led the pack, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. The Thunderwolves had the evidence. They had the file, but they were far from safe. The authorities were closing in, and Ward, the mastermind behind Project Blackout, wasn't the kind of man who would go down quietly. The truth was out there, and Jack could feel it in his gut that the real battle was just beginning. As they sped through the night, heading toward a hidden safe house, Jack's mind was spinning. They had made it this far, but how long would it take before Ward and his people tracked them down? The last few hours had been a blur, fighting their way out of the facility, racing through the streets to get to the diner in Green Ridge, and finally handing the file over to Sarah. Now, they needed to get to the next step. Exposing the operation, getting the information to the right people, and making sure Ward couldn't bury it. The Thunderwolves had proven they could survive a fight, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about bringing down an empire. Jack glanced back at Aisha, still riding behind one of the bikers. She was holding on tight, but her eyes were alert. She had changed over the past few days, no longer just a scared girl, but someone with fire in her eyes. Jack didn't know how much longer she could hold up, but he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. She was part of this fight, whether she wanted to be or not. He couldn't protect her from everything, but he would fight like hell to make sure she stayed safe. The night was dark and quiet, save for the sound of the engines and the occasional burst of static from their radios. Jack's thoughts drifted back to the file, the evidence they had just handed over. They had the smoking gun. Ward couldn't cover it up anymore. The people who were pulling the strings, those responsible for the dark experiments, the manipulation of innocent lives, were about to be exposed. But would it be enough? Would it be enough to stop the machine that had been built? Jack didn't know, but he was willing to take that chance. As they approached the safe house, Jack's mind shifted to the next phase. They had to lay low, regroup, and make sure they were one step ahead of the authorities and anyone loyal to Ward. The safe house was tucked away in the woods, far from the nearest town. They parked their bikes in the hidden garage, the engines silencing as the last of the bikes pulled in. Jack looked at his brothers. Each one of them had come a long way. They were family, and they had each other's backs. No matter what happened next, Jack knew they'd face it together. He turned to Elena, who had been coordinating with their contacts. "What's the plan?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. Elena, looking more tired than ever, exhaled slowly. "We need to keep moving," she said, her eyes focused. "The authorities might be coming soon, but I've got a few people on the inside who can help us. We can't sit here for too long, though. Once they figure out where we are, we're done." Jack nodded. "We'll stay on the move, then. No one gets left behind." He turned to the rest of the group, his eyes sweeping across their faces. "We've got the evidence. We've got the proof. Now it's time to finish this." As Jack looked around the safe house, he realized how much was at stake. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about exposing a system, about stopping Ward from continuing his twisted experiments. The people who were involved had to be held accountable, and if they were going to do this, they had to do it right. They couldn't afford mistakes. The clock was ticking. "Let's get some rest." "While we can," Jack said, his voice low but commanding. "We'll move out at first light. We'll hit them hard, and we'll hit them fast. No time to waste." The Thunderwolves settled into the safe house, preparing for the next phase of the mission. Jack kept his eyes on the file, still in his possession. He couldn't stop thinking about what they had learned, about the people behind Project Blackout and the web of lies they had built. Ward might have thought he had control, but he was wrong. They had the upper hand now. Jack turned to Aisha one last time, his expression softening. "We're going to stop them," he said, his voice filled with resolve. Aisha nodded, her gaze firm, no longer just the scared little girl she had been days before. She was ready for whatever came next. Jack knew this was their moment, their chance to bring down Ward and expose the truth. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and challenges, but Jack had no intention of stopping. Not until the truth was out there, and Ward's empire crumbled. The Thunderwolves were ready. The battle wasn't over, but they were prepared to fight until the very end. The dawn was breaking as Jack and the Thunderwolves gathered around the table in the safe house, the weight of the night still hanging heavily in the air. They had made it through the night without being discovered, but they weren't safe yet. Jack's mind raced, thinking about the next steps. They had the evidence, they had the names, and they had the support they needed to bring down Sergeant Derek Ward. But Ward wasn't a man who would fall easily. He had connections, influence, and power. But Jack and his crew had something he didn't: determination. "We move in an hour," Jack said, breaking the silence. "Everyone gets ready. No mistakes." The Thunderwolves nodded, their faces grim but resolute. They had been through countless battles together, but this one felt different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a fight to expose a system of corruption, a fight to bring justice to the people who had been hurt by Ward and his operation. Jack's eyes scanned the room, landing on Aisha. She had been quiet, but there was a fire in her eyes now, a fire that wasn't there before. She had seen too much, experienced too much, but she was still standing. "You good?" Jack asked, his voice low but supportive. Aisha looked up at him and nodded. I'm good, she said, her voice steady. Jack gave her a reassuring smile before turning back to the group. He didn't have time to waste. Ward's empire was built on secrecy and lies, and it was time to bring it all crashing down. He grabbed the file, the one that had started it all, the file that held the truth about Project Blackout and Ward's role in it. He couldn't afford to let this slip away. We've got one shot at this, Jack said, his voice steady. Ward's not going to go down without a fight, but we're ready for him. We expose him today. The Thunderwolves gathered their things, loading up their weapons and gear, each one preparing for what was about to unfold. They knew the risks. They knew what they were up against, but none of them hesitated. They had come this far, and they weren't about to back down now. As they mounted their bikes, the sun was fully up, casting a golden glow over the town. But the brightness of the day felt false, like a mask covering the darkness that was about to unfold. Jack revved his engine, the sound of the motorcycle filling the air. His brothers followed suit, and together, they rode out, their mission clear. They didn't have long before Ward's men would come after them. Jack could feel the tension building in his chest. The safe house had been a temporary refuge, but it was time to face what was coming. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for everyone who had been silenced, for the families that had been torn apart by Ward's twisted plans. Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars as they sped down the road. The mission was clear: get to Ward, expose his operation, and make sure he never hurt anyone again. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but Jack wasn't afraid. With the Thunderwolves by his side, he knew they could take on anything. The sound of their engines echoed through the empty streets as they approached their destination. They were close now, too close for comfort. As they turned a corner, Jack saw the building ahead. It was a fortress, guarded and heavily secured. Ward had made sure no one could get in without a fight. Jack signaled to the group to slow down, the bikes coming to a stop at the edge of the alley. They were going to have to approach this carefully. One wrong move, and they could be surrounded. Jack dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a quiet thud. He turned to the group, his voice steady. Stay sharp. We get in, we get the evidence, and we get out. No exceptions. They nodded in unison, their faces hard, their eyes focused. Jack couldn't afford to show any weakness now. They had come too far. The time for hesitation was over. They moved through the shadows, staying low and keeping to the edges of the building. They were close, but Jack knew it wouldn't be easy. Ward's men would be watching, waiting for any sign of movement. They reached the back entrance, the door locked and reinforced. One of the Thunderwolves quickly set to work on the lock, his fingers moving deftly. With a click, the door opened. They slipped inside, the sound of their boots muffled on the concrete floor. The building was quiet, but Jack could feel the tension in the air. Every hallway they passed felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. They moved through the corridors, their footsteps light but deliberate. Jack's hand rested on the gun at his side, ready for whatever came next. They reached the room where they knew Ward's office was located. The door was heavily guarded, but the Thunderwolves were ready. They breached the door in a flash, the guards barely having time to react. Jack was the first to enter, his eyes scanning the room. Ward wasn't there yet, but the evidence they needed was. Jack quickly grabbed the files from the desk, scanning them for anything useful. He found what they needed: documents linking Ward to the military, the contractors, and the shady experiments. It was all there, but they weren't done yet. Get the computers, Jack ordered. We need everything. The Thunderwolves moved quickly, their hands flying over the keyboards. They didn't have much time. Jack could hear the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Ward's men were closing in. They had to finish this now. Jack grabbed the hard drive as the others loaded up the documents and data. We're done here, Jack said, his voice steady. Let's go. They raced out of the room. But just as they reached the hallway, the door slammed shut behind them. Ward's men had arrived. Jack knew this wasn't over yet, but they had what they came for. The truth was in their hands now, and they weren't going to let anyone stop them from exposing it. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Jack's pulse quickened. They had made it out of Ward's office with the evidence they needed, but now they were trapped. The hallway was narrowing, the exit slipping further away as Ward's men closed in from both sides. Jack motioned for the group to spread out, his mind working at full speed. They couldn't afford to be cornered, not now. Not when they had everything they needed to bring Ward down. Stay low. Jack whispered, his voice steady, despite the urgency in his tone. The Thunderwolves nodded, their bodies moving like one as they fanned out along the walls, trying to stay hidden in the shadows. The building was a maze, and the footsteps grew louder as Ward's men searched for them. Jack felt the weight of the hard drive in his pocket, the truth they had gathered pressing against him like a ticking bomb. There was no way out if they didn't act quickly. The Thunderwolves weren't going to make it out of here without a fight. Jack could feel the tension building in the air. His mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. They couldn't wait for reinforcements. They had to move now, before they were surrounded. Move! Jack suddenly barked, and the Thunderwolves sprang into action. They dashed for the back exit, the sound of their boots pounding on the floor mingling with the approaching footsteps of the guards. But as they reached the door, Jack cursed under his breath. It was locked. He pulled out his knife, working quickly to pry the door open, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of footsteps was now deafening, and Jack could feel the heat rising in his chest. They were almost there. The door creaked open just enough for them to slip through, but it was only a temporary escape. Jack glanced over his shoulder to make sure everyone was with him. "Keep moving," he shouted. They bolted through the back alley, the bright sunlight blinding them for a moment. But as soon as they were out in the open, the sound of engines revving reached their ears. Jack turned just in time to see a squad of black SUVs screeching around the corner, heading straight toward them. The authorities had arrived, but they weren't going to stop. Jack gave the signal, and the Thunderwolves split up, each one disappearing into the alleyways, disappearing from sight like ghosts. Jack made sure Aisha was behind him as they darted down another side street, their bodies low to the ground, moving as quickly and quietly as they could. They couldn't risk being caught. Not now. Not with the evidence so close to being exposed. The streets were packed with cars, but Jack didn't care. He couldn't stop now. He had to get to the bikes, and he had to get to the safe house. The mission was far from over, and the clock was ticking. As they reached the bikes, Jack's eyes scanned the area. There was no sign of Ward's men yet, but he knew they wouldn't be far behind. They were all running out of time. Jack mounted his bike, the engine roaring to life beneath him. He glanced over at the rest of the Thunderwolves, making sure they were ready. They couldn't afford to wait. "Let's go," Jack shouted, and the group took off, racing down the street and into the open highway. The sound of the motorcycles blended with the distant sirens, but Jack didn't look back. He focused on the road ahead, his mind set on the goal. They had the truth. Now, they had to get it out there. They had to bring Ward down before it was too late. As they sped through the empty streets, Jack felt a sense of urgency rise in his chest. The authorities might be closing in, but they couldn't stop him. Not now. The Thunderwolves had been through too much. They had come too far. This wasn't just about getting away anymore. This was about taking down the system that had kept people like Ward in power for too long. They had exposed him, and now it was time to finish the job. The safe house was still a few miles away, but Jack could feel the tension in his shoulders ease as they got further from the building. They were in the clear, for now. But Jack knew the danger wasn't over. Ward would stop at nothing to protect his empire, and if they weren't careful, they would become his next target. As they pulled into the safe house, Jack looked at his brothers, his family. "We're not done yet," he said. "This is just the beginning. We've got what we need. Now it's time to make sure the world knows the truth." The Thunderwolves nodded in agreement. They had come too far to stop now. They had made it out alive, but the real fight had just begun. They weren't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The safe house was quiet, but the air inside was thick with anticipation. Jack stood by the window, looking out at the morning light breaking over the horizon, the weight of what they had just done pressing down on him. They had escaped the chaos, but the war wasn't over. They had the evidence, and they had exposed the truth about Project Blackout. But now the fight to bring down Sergeant Derek Ward and his entire operation was just beginning. Jack turned away from the window, his gaze meeting the eyes of his brothers. They had all been through so much, and each of them was carrying the weight of what had been done. But they had made it this far. "We've done everything we can," Jack said, his voice steady, but filled with resolve. "Now it's up to the world to take it from here." The Thunderwolves nodded in unison. They had fought to expose the truth, and they had given everything they had to make sure it was out there. Aisha, who had been quietly sitting in the corner, finally spoke up. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice softer than before, but still strong. Jack looked at her and smiled, proud of the courage she had shown. Now, he said, we wait. The truth's out. People will take notice. But Ward won't give up without a fight. We need to stay sharp. Elena, who had been working on the logistics behind the scenes, stepped forward. I've already sent everything to the press. They're running with it. Ward's not going to be able to hide anymore, she said. Jack nodded, but a part of him still worried. Ward wasn't the kind of man who would go down easily. His empire was built on control, on silencing those who got in his way. But Jack was done running. He had already lost too much. Ward had taken away people he cared about, but Jack was determined to make sure he didn't get away with it. The battle's not over, Jack said, his eyes hard. Ward still has power, and there are people in high places protecting him. But we're not backing down. Not now. As the group began to settle in, Jack could feel the weight of the situation starting to ease, but he knew better than to get too comfortable. The fight was far from over. A knock at the door interrupted the tense silence. Jack tensed, his hand instinctively going to the sidearm he kept by his waist. He moved cautiously toward the door, his eyes scanning for any sign of danger. But when he opened it, he was met with a familiar face. It's done, Sarah said, stepping inside. She was one of Elena's trusted contacts, and she had been working behind the scenes to ensure the story got out to the right people. Jack exhaled in relief, his muscles relaxing slightly. It's out there. The press is already picking it up. There's no going back now. Jack looked at his brothers, then at Aisha. She had made it through this nightmare, but Jack could see the toll it had taken on her. She was still a child, but she had become a symbol of everything they were fighting for: the truth, justice, and the fight to expose the corruption that had plagued so many innocent lives. We did it, Jack said, his voice softening. But this isn't over. Ward's not going to go quietly. The door slammed open suddenly, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. But it wasn't Ward's men. It was another biker, one of their own, panting as if he had run all the way there. Jack, you need to see this, he said, his voice frantic. Jack's pulse spiked as he followed the biker outside. On the horizon, the unmistakable sight of black SUVs was coming into view. They weren't alone. Ward's men had found them again. It's a trap, Jack muttered under his breath. They've come for us. The Thunderwolves quickly gathered their gear, their faces set with determination. They had exposed the truth, but Ward wasn't going to let it stand. He was coming for them, for the file, for anyone who knew what he had done. But Jack was done running. The Thunderwolves weren't going to back down now. We ride, Jack said, his voice low and steady, the weight of the situation hanging over them. We fight for what's right. We make sure Ward and his people don't walk away from this. The group quickly mounted their bikes, the engines roaring to life as they revved up and prepared for what was to come. They had made it this far, and they weren't going to let Ward's empire destroy everything they had fought for. The Thunderwolves sped down the road, the sound of their engines echoing through the empty streets. Jack led the pack, knowing that this wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was their last stand. They had exposed the truth. Now, they were going to make sure it stayed exposed. They weren't going to let Ward win. They would bring him down, no matter the cost. Jack glanced back at Aisha one last time, a silent promise in his eyes. No matter what happened, they were in this together. And the fight for the truth was just beginning. Hell Angel stories have always been full of action, mystery, and the fight against overwhelming odds. In this gripping tale, we follow the Thunderwolves, a close-knit group of bikers who find themselves caught in a dangerous mission to expose a sinister military project. As they uncover the truth behind Project Blackout, they must outwit powerful enemies, including the ruthless Sergeant Derek Ward, whose empire of lies and manipulation has put countless lives at risk. With danger closing in from all sides, the Thunderwolves take to the road in a high-stakes chase for justice, determined to reveal the secrets that could bring down Ward's operation. Along the way, they face countless obstacles, but their bond and commitment to each other push them forward. These Hell Angels stories explore themes of loyalty, bravery, and the fight to bring justice, even when the odds seem impossible. Will the Thunderwolves succeed in their mission, or will Ward's influence prove too strong to overcome? Find out as this thrilling tale unfolds, with Hell Angels stories that captivate with every twist and turn. As they race against time, their resolve is tested, but they will stop at nothing to make sure the truth is exposed, no matter the cost. These Hell Angel stories are more than just a fight for survival. They are about uncovering the truth, bringing down corrupt systems, and standing up for what is right. Get ready for a ride full of tension, suspense, and raw emotion as the Thunderwolves take on one of their toughest challenges yet.